we're going to have on the small banking and small business and how banking affects your business. But thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Mr. Santos, I know that since I've been in Congress, we've had several terrible accidents that's involved mining and explosions and other things. And sometimes Congress tends to have a knee-jerk reaction rather than sitting down and looking at facts and details and talking to the people that are involved in the business. Do you know of anybody that handles explosives that aren't careful?
Unfortunately, yes. Aside from accidents that are caused by flying material when the button's pushed, the second most frequent cause of accidents is misuse of the product. As someone doing something.
Would education solve that or more regulation?
Education helps, but education only reaches a small proportion of our community. The ones that attend seminars and get training are probably not the ones making mistakes. What we see, especially in the small business community, is that they rely on the regulation as the ceiling of performance. And that's where they feel they need to operate. So they reach that level and they feel that they're good. Unfortunately, this is not good enough.
Well, I understand, but I thought you mentioned that the regulations didn't really conform with your best practices of handling explosives.
That's true. That's true. And fortunately, the vast majority of people in mining operate above the level set by the regulations, demanded by the mine operators, the suppliers of the products, and the employees themselves, because there's a considerable self-preservation interest here.
So you're thinking there needs to be more regulation on the mining industry?
We think the regulations need to be consistent, not necessarily more. The problem comes about through inconsistency and confusion and wasting of resources, citations for things that are simply not an issue. And those should go away. Those issues, regulations that were written for the use of black powder, for example, which is something we don't do today. They're still on the books.
But I'm kind of confused about your statement that education doesn't get to everybody, but I'm assuming you're saying that regulations do, and that the regulations aren't up to the best practices, so I'm confused. If they're not up to the best practices and your people don't get education, then how do they know what the regulations are?
Oh, MSHA enforces the regulation. They're aware of what the regulation is. MSHA has training requirements, for example, that the employees must be trained on the regulation. We think that there needs to be consistency in the regulation, which would elevate the level of safety in those operations that operate right at that ceiling.
And when you say consistency in the regulations, are you talking about the different types of explosive businesses, or what are you talking about as consistency?
I'm talking about practices, differences in practices. For example, a small blasting contractor may blast in a construction site one day, a quarry the next, and a coal mine the next. All three of those performance regulations would be different, and he must adjust his practices and procedures at each one of those sites. And that is a very difficult process. As you pointed out, we are regulated by up to 3,000 entities, and consistency is paramount.
Yeah, so what you're saying is the inconsistency could bring about confusion.
That's right.
And more area for something else.
And leaves gaps. When you let something sit in 71, gaps develop.
Well, Mr. Chairman, that's all the questions I have. I want to thank you for doing this, and look forward to us having some more of these. And as most small businesses, we're result-oriented, and hopefully these hearings will have a result.
Well, the follow-through is important, and thank you for your participation as always, Mr. Westmoreland. we're not going to have a regulation-free environment. I think we all understand that, and we probably should not for a lot of the obvious reasons. The importance is the time, the place, the manner of the regulation that doesn't impede, is not a detriment to our citizens. And that's the goal that we all share, whether you're Republican, Democrat, or whatever. But we have some really good people that are really vested in this particular endeavor, and we're going to need your help. So what I'd like to end the hearing with giving each the members of the last panel 1 minute to tell us anything that you think we haven't heard or that you believe we should walk away with as maybe this one very important message, and what do you like us to do? Anything that's on your mind. You've got 1 minute, and we'll start with Mr. Renker.
Okay. I certainly, in my testimony, I mentioned a period of time during negotiations with the government with regard to our fees. Again, we're selected on qualifications, and then we negotiate our fees with the government. If you notice, it took us over 100 days, almost 115 days, to negotiate our contract with the federal government, and 200 hours on my part, which are uncompensated hours. And the negotiation process is extremely onerous and almost caused me to walk away from the contract, quite frankly. They negotiate hourly rates and overhead as if we were a large company, you know, the Bechtels or whatever. And, you know, when we look at my firm, the person who keeps the books on a day-to-day basis is me. And during negotiations, they asked for accounting information that's just not available. And I had to tell them, look, I'm sorry, but you can't get blood from a stone. And it dragged on the negotiations for quite a bit, and it made it very, very difficult even to negotiate the contract. And I would hope that, and we're talking about this maybe for another year or another time, that we look into how the federal government negotiates with a small business versus a large business, and maybe make some allowances for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Van Pute.
I think if there's one thing I'd like you to take away, and like the committee to take away with this, is first off something it seems self-evident to us, but doesn't seem to be to the government, is that small business is different from big business. Small business owners, unless their business happens to be a law office or an accounting office, are usually not lawyers or accountants. They're bakers, or they're mechanics, or flag makers, or they're craftspeople who have a passion for what they do, and they want to do it and be able to turn that into the ability to make a living and be an entrepreneur. Unfortunately, we live in a world where, yes, we need regulation, but it's the onerous and the burdensome, redundant regulations that end up making those craftspeople and these people who are artisans and skilled people who want to use their hands, use their ability to make a living and employ people, have to become lawyers and accountants or pay gobs of money to lawyers and accountants just to be able to survive. And I think that's where I would hope that the government would understand. Big business has an incredible advantage because they have, you know, lineup of lawyers and accountants and lobbyists and everything that they've got to look out for them that are on salary and they're paying all the time. When a small business has to go to this, again, we're having to go out and pay full retail, and it's a very expensive proposition. And so simple rules that a layman can understand would just go a long way, and maybe not 31 pages of instructions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Scribner.
I'd like to echo what Mr.